It is shortly after 2 in the morning on May 14, 2008, on a gravel road somewhere in the farm country of southwestern Minnesota, and 19-year-old Brandon Swanson is on the phone with his father. He has been walking for close to 47 minutes, describing fence lines and the sound of water in the distance, trying to explain where he is to a man who cannot see him. Brandon Swanson is driving through the darkness, flashing his headlights, hoping his son will spot them from wherever he is. Brandon says he cannot. His father cannot see him either. Nothing but empty fields and gravel roads stretching out in every direction. And then, mid-sentence, still narrating his walk, Brandon says 2 words. "Oh, shit." And the line goes quiet. His father waits. He calls out his son's name into the phone. He hears nothing back. No shout, no scuffle, no labored breathing, nothing that would explain what just happened. The call does not disconnect right away. There is simply silence on the other end, stretching out long enough for Brian to sit in his truck in the dark, gripping the wheel, waiting for his son to say something, anything, to explain what he'd just seen or heard. Nothing comes. Eventually, the call ends. Brian and Annette try calling Brandon back. Voicemail. They try again. Voicemail. They try again after that. Nothing. Brandon Swanson has not been seen or heard from since that moment. More than 15 years later, no one, not his family, not investigators, not the state of Minnesota, which would go on to change its missing persons laws because of what happened to him, knows what happened to Brandon in the seconds after he said those 2 words and went silent. To understand how a college student can vanish into thin air on a rural road he had driven 100 times before, it helps to go back to the beginning, to who Brandon was before that night, and to the ordinary evening that turned, without warning, into one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances in Minnesota's history. Before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. Someone watching right now might live near the fields and back roads where this case went cold, and that person might remember something no one has thought to mention yet. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989. The older of 2 children born to Brian and Annette Swanson. He grew up in and around Marshall, Minnesota, a small city of roughly 13,000 to 14,000 people in the state's southwestern farm country, an area built on agriculture, not the kind of place that expects to become the setting for a story like this one. By every account gathered from those who knew him, Brandon was an easy kid to love and an easy kid to worry about losing. According to the Charlie Project, his mother described him as an avid reader with wide-ranging interests, and as someone deeply devoted to his family. Other accounts describe him as intelligent, funny, and outgoing, the kind of teenager who did well in school without seeming to try too hard, who would rather dig into a new topic on his own than sit in front of a television. He had a curiosity about how things worked, an interest that eventually pointed him toward the sciences. As the older sibling, he was, by multiple accounts, protective of his younger sister. The 2 of them fought the way siblings do, but those closest to the family have described a real bond forming between them as they both grew older. The kind of relationship that was just beginning to shift from childhood squabbling into something more like friendship. Brandon worked at the Hy-Vee grocery store in Marshall for 4 years, the final 2 of those years in the bakery department, a job that, by most accounts, suited someone as steady and reliable as he was. He graduated from Marshall Senior High School in the spring of 2007. Rather than moving away right after graduation, he chose to stay close to home for 1 more year, enrolling in the wind energy program at Minnesota West Community and Technical College's campus in Canby, roughly 45 minutes from Marshall. Renewable energy was, by multiple accounts, a genuine interest of his, an early pull toward a field that, in 2007, was still relatively new in the American Midwest. He had already begun making plans for what came after Canby, a transfer to Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, Iowa, some 250 miles from his family, with hopes of eventually completing a 4-year degree in the sciences. For a young man who had spent his whole life within driving distance of his parents, it would have meant his first real step out into the world on his own. May 13, 2008, was the last day of classes for the academic year at Minnesota West. For Brandon, it marked the close of that first year away from full-time high school, one chapter finished, a new one already taking shape on the horizon. That evening, he stayed in Canby to celebrate with friends and classmates, moving between 2 different gatherings over the course of the night. Those who were with him told investigators afterward that Brandon had been drinking at both parties but did not appear visibly intoxicated. Sometime before midnight, he said his goodbyes and got into his car, a green Chevrolet Lumina that, according to those who knew him, he genuinely loved driving, for what should have been a routine 45-minute drive south to his parents' house in Marshall. It was a route he had made countless times over the past year, familiar enough that no one who knew him would have thought twice about him making it alone, in the dark, after a night out. He never arrived. Now that you know who Brandon was, a young man just starting to build his own future while still looking out for the people he loved, does he remind you of anyone in your own life? Let me know in the comments. Keeping his memory human is part of what keeps cases like his alive. Sometime in the early morning hours of May 14th, driving along a rural stretch of road north of Highway 68 that ran roughly parallel to his usual route home, Brandon's car left the roadway and became stuck in a ditch. He was not injured. At approximately 12:30 a.m., he called his parents to tell them what had happened and to ask for a ride. Brian and Annette got into their truck without hesitation and set out to find him, staying on the phone with Brandon as they searched the dark farmland for any sign of him or his car. What followed was nearly 2.5 hours of a family trying to solve a puzzle none of them had the pieces for. Brandon believed he was near the small town of Lynd, not far from home, a reasonable guess given the route he normally drove. His parents searched roads near Lynd and found nothing. As the minutes stretched into an hour and then longer, frustration crept into the conversation on both ends. Brandon insisted on his location. His parents insisted they were exactly where he described and could see no car, no headlights, no sign of him at all. At one point in the back and forth, Annette hung up out of sheer frustration. She called back almost immediately afterward to apologize, and the search continued. Eventually, Brandon told his parents he was going to get out and walk toward a cluster of lights he could see in the distance, which he believed marked the direction of Lynd. He suggested they meet him in the parking lot of a well-known local nightclub in town. Brian agreed. He dropped Annette back home so she could try to get some rest, then turned the truck back around and drove toward Lynd alone, staying on the phone with his son the entire way. What neither Brandon nor his parents knew at the time was that Brandon was nowhere near where he believed himself to be. Investigators would later determine, using cell tower data recovered from Brandon's phone records, that he was actually roughly 25 miles from Lynd, in a completely different direction, closer to the small township of Porter. It is one of the most disorienting details in the entire case. A young man who had made the same 45-minute drive home more times than he could count, confidently narrating a location to his own father and being off by 25 miles in the opposite direction, with no idea that anything was wrong. As he walked, Brandon did his best to describe his surroundings. He told his father he was following a fence line. He said he could hear water somewhere nearby. Brian drove roads that matched none of it, flashing his headlights out into fields that stayed dark and empty no matter where he pointed them. Brandon said he couldn't see any lights from his father's truck. Brian couldn't see any sign of his son either. Just open Minnesota farmland stretching out on either side of the road, indistinguishable from any other stretch of gravel in the county. By most accounts of the case, the call had gone on for roughly 47 minutes when Brandon, still narrating his walk to his father, still describing what he could see and hear around him, suddenly interrupted himself. "Oh shit," he said. And then nothing. Brian stayed on the line. He called out his son's name, waiting for a response. There wasn't one. No cry out, no sound of a struggle, no explanation of what he'd just seen or tripped over or startled. Just an unbroken silence that, according to those who have spoken about the case since, felt like it stretched on forever, even though it likely lasted only a matter of minutes before the call itself ended. Brian tried calling Brandon back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again, and again after that. Nothing. By 6:30 that morning, with still no word from their son, Annette Swanson called the Lyon County Sheriff's Department to report Brandon missing. According to multiple accounts of the case, the initial response from law enforcement was far from urgent. Deputies reportedly told the family that it wasn't unusual for a 19-year-old to stay out all night after a party, and that as a legal adult, Brandon technically had the right to be missing if that was what he'd chosen to do. Annette has since described the agony of trying to explain, over and over, that this was different, that her son had been mid-sentence on the phone with his father when the call went silent, and that nothing about the way it happened felt voluntary. It reportedly took hours of pleading before deputies agreed to treat Brandon's disappearance with the urgency his family already felt in their bones. That afternoon, investigators finally traced Brandon's last cell phone signal to a tower northwest of Marshall. Using that data, they located his car, the green Lumina, sitting on the edge of a field near the border of Lyon and Lincoln counties, roughly a mile and a half north of Highway 68, nowhere close to where Brandon had believed himself to be walking hours earlier. The car showed no signs of a violent crash, no signs of a struggle. Its doors were open. The keys were missing. Beyond that, there was almost nothing to go on. No blood, no torn clothing, no obvious indication of what had happened to the 19-year-old who had climbed out of it hours before and started walking toward what he thought was home. Investigators had a cell tower ping, a stranded car with the keys missing, and 47 minutes of a phone call that ended in 2 words and total silence. But the trail went cold from there. What do you think happened to Brandon out on that road? Drop your theory in the comments. With the car located, the Lyon County Sheriff's Department brought in search dogs, including a team of bloodhounds from Codington County, South Dakota, to try to pick up Brandon's trail. According to Wikipedia's sourced account of the case, the dogs picked up a scent that ran roughly 3 miles across open fields and gravel roads, past an abandoned farm, and ultimately down to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, a river that, at the time, was running high and fast with spring runoff. Brandon had mentioned to his father, during those final minutes on the phone, that he could hear water somewhere nearby as he walked. Investigators theorized that he may have attempted to cross the river in the dark and been swept away by the current. For weeks afterward, much of the search effort concentrated on the water itself. Dive teams, boats, and searchers working the banks in both directions, looking for any sign of Brandon or his belongings. That theory did not hold up for long. Investigators and outside observers alike have noted that if Brandon had drowned in the Yellow Medicine River, his body would most likely have surfaced downstream within a reasonable stretch of time, especially given how thoroughly that stretch of river was searched in the weeks and months that followed. It never did. In the years since, authorities have returned to the river more than once to search it again, including a full excavation in 2021, when a period of drought left large sections of the riverbed completely dry and exposed. That search, like the ones before it, turned up nothing connected to Brandon. Beyond the river theory, investigators have never publicly identified a suspect, a named person of interest, or a confirmed alternate explanation for what happened to Brandon Swanson that night. No one has been charged in connection with his disappearance, and no evidence has ever surfaced pointing definitively toward foul play, an accident, or anything else. The case remains, in the most literal sense possible, exactly what it was on the morning of May 14, 2008. A 19-year-old who was mid-sentence with his father one moment and gone the next, with investigators still unable to say why. For years now, Brandon's family has waited for the phone to ring with real news, the kind of call that actually answers something instead of asking more questions. If you've ever had to wait that long for any kind of resolution, I want to hear about it in the comments. That kind of patience deserves to be acknowledged. In the weeks and months after Brandon vanished, the search effort grew well beyond what law enforcement alone could manage. Community volunteers, professional search and rescue organizations, and Brandon's own circle of friends combed the rural landscape around Lynd, Porter, and Taunton on foot, on horseback, and from the air, covering the same fields and gravel roads again and again, in the hope that something, anything, had been missed the first time. Aerial teams flew overflights of the search area. Ground teams walked the same stretches of farmland in expanding grids, week after week, through that first summer and into the fall. Search efforts have continued, in one form or another, for more than a decade and a half since. That persistence has not come without obstacles. Some landowners in the search area have, at various points, declined to allow law enforcement or volunteer searchers onto their private property, though several of them have told investigators they would keep an eye out for anything unusual on their own land in the meantime. The geography that makes southwestern Minnesota so difficult to search, mile after mile of farmland, much of it privately owned, crossed by gravel roads that all look remarkably similar in the dark, is the same geography that may have disoriented Brandon in the first place, and it has made the search for him just as disorienting for everyone who has taken part in it since. Brandon's disappearance did not just leave a family without answers. It changed how the state of Minnesota handles missing adult cases going forward. Frustrated by what she and her husband experienced in the hours after Brandon's call went silent, the delays, the assumptions, the suggestion that their son simply had the right to be missing, Annette Swanson became an advocate for legislative change. She helped push for a bill that became known as Brandon's Law, passed by the Minnesota legislature in 2009. The law requires police departments to begin an immediate investigation whenever an adult under the age of 21 is reported missing, along with older adults reported missing under suspicious or out-of-character circumstances. It also assigns jurisdiction for the case to the department covering the missing person's home, rather than the department covering wherever they were last seen, a direct response to the confusion and delay that slowed down the earliest hours of the search for Brandon. In the years since, several other states have passed similar legislation, carrying the same name. A lasting legacy built directly out of what the Swansons went through trying to get anyone to take their son's disappearance seriously in those first critical hours. We're about to reach the point where investigators had their best shot at finally cracking this case. Before we get there, what do you think it will take to finally solve it, all these years later? Drop your guess in the comments before you keep watching. There has never been a definitive breakthrough in Brandon Swanson's case. No arrest, no confession, no recovered remains, no single piece of evidence that has ever tied the disappearance to a clear explanation. What has continued, according to Lyon County Sheriff Eric Wallen, is a steady trickle of tips coming in year after year. Speaking to reporters around the 18th anniversary of Brandon's disappearance, Sheriff Wallen confirmed that his office, working alongside the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, continues to receive and investigate leads to this day. Not all of those tips contain new information. Some are repeats of details investigators already have on file, but according to Wallen, they have never fully stopped coming in, which is part of what keeps the case technically active rather than fully cold, even after all this time. Cell tower technology, the same tool that first led investigators to Brandon's car back in 2008, remains one of the clearest and most concrete pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Proof that Brandon was in the area near Porter, roughly 25 miles from where he genuinely believed himself to be, at the exact time of his final call home. As Sheriff Wallen has explained, that cell tower data gave investigators a general area to focus on from the very beginning, even as the rest of the case has remained frustratingly short on physical evidence. Beyond that single data point and the 3-mile scent trail that led searchers to the Yellow Medicine River, investigators have never publicly pointed to one explanation that accounts for all of the known facts. Did Brandon become disoriented in the dark and fall somewhere he has never been found? Did the river, despite the earlier doubts about it, somehow play a role after all? Did something, or someone, intervene in those final moments before he said, "Oh shit," and went quiet? Investigators have not publicly ruled anything out, and in the absence of a body or any definitive physical evidence, every theory that has circulated around this case over the years remains exactly that, a theory, not a conclusion. What is not in question is how thoroughly this particular stretch of Minnesota has been searched. Ground teams, aerial searches, river excavations, including the 2021 drought search that exposed riverbed no one had ever been able to examine before, cadaver dogs, cell tower data, and now, well over a decade and a half of accumulated tips from the public. All of it has been pursued in one form or another, and none of it has produced Brandon, his cell phone, his car keys, or any confirmed physical trace of what happened to him in the moments after his father heard him say those two final words. For years, Brandon's family has kept his story alive through every kind of setback imaginable: false leads, denied searches, and long stretches of silence from investigators. If you've ever had to hold on to hope through that kind of uncertainty, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Today, Brandon Swanson would be in his late 30s, old enough by now to have built the kind of life he was just beginning to plan for back in the spring of 2008, when he was mapping out a transfer to Iowa and a future in the sciences. His parents, Brian and Annette, have never stopped searching for him, and they have never stopped advocating on his behalf, whether through the passage of Brandon's law or through the simple, ongoing act of keeping his story in front of the public, year after year, so that his case does not quietly slide into obscurity the way so many long unsolved disappearances eventually do. What has made Brandon Swanson's case endure in the public imagination in a way that so many other missing person cases never do is not anything sensational. It's the opposite. It's how ordinary the night began. A college student finishing up a school year, a celebration with friends, a short, familiar drive home that thousands of other 19-year-olds have made without incident on thousands of other nights. A car stuck in a ditch, inconvenient, but not dangerous. A father getting in his truck to come pick up his son, the way fathers have always done, staying on the phone with him the entire time to make sure he wasn't alone out there in the dark. And then, in an instant, with no warning and no explanation, nothing at all. The Lyon County Sheriff's Department, and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension continue to investigate the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, and tips are still being reviewed as they come in. More than 15 years after that final phone call ended in silence on a gravel road that neither Brandon nor his father could ever quite agree on the location of. If you have any information about this case, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem to you, you are asked to contact the Lyon County Sheriff's Office or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension at 651-793-7000. Brandon's family is still out there tonight, still waiting, still hoping that one day the questions that have followed them since that morning in May of 2008 will finally have an answer, and that whatever Brandon saw or heard or ran into in those final 47 minutes will finally be known. If this case affected you the way it has affected so many others who have heard it, consider subscribing to the Silence Evidence, where we tell the stories of cases like Brandon's, cases that deserve to be remembered, and families who deserve, after everything, to finally be heard. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.